My name is Marcus, and this happened 3 years ago during what was supposed to be a simple weekend solo hike. I've been hiking since I was a kid, nothing too extreme, but I know my way around a trail well enough to feel confident going out on my own. The trail I picked was called the Pine Ridge Loop, about an 8-mile circuit through some state forest land about 2 hours north of where I live in Pennsylvania. The trail description said it would take most people around 5 to 6 hours to complete, which sounded perfect for a Saturday adventure. I left my apartment around 7 a.m. that morning and made good time getting to the trailhead. The morning was perfect for hiking. It was mid-October, so the leaves were changing colors, and there was this crisp feeling in the air that made you want to just keep walking forever. The first hour or so went exactly as planned. The trail was well marked with those blue blazes painted on trees every 50 yards or so, and the path itself was clear and easy to follow. I passed a couple of other hikers going the opposite direction, exchanged the usual friendly nods and good mornings, and just enjoyed being out there in the woods. But somewhere around the 3-mile mark, I started noticing something that didn't sit right with me. I'd been following the blue blazes the entire time, but I kept getting this nagging feeling that I was walking through areas I'd already seen before. Not identical, but similar enough to make me question whether I was still on the right path. At first, I brushed it off. A lot of forest terrain can look pretty much the same. But then, I came to this distinctive fallen log that stretched across the trail, and I could have sworn I had climbed over that exact same log about an hour earlier. I stopped and pulled out my phone to check my location. The GPS showed that I was still on the Pine Ridge Loop, but according to the map, I should have been much further along by now. I had been hiking for almost 4 hours at that point, which meant I should have been close to completing the circuit. Instead, the little blue dot on my phone showed me in an area that looked like I was maybe halfway through the trail at best. That didn't make any sense. I decided to keep going and see if things started looking more familiar. But as I continued following the blue blazes, the feeling that I was retracing my steps only got stronger. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a tree with a distinctive scar on its bark, like someone had taken a machete to it years ago. I remembered that tree. I had specifically noticed it earlier because the scar looked almost like a lightning bolt. But here's the thing that really freaked me out. When I had passed that tree the first time, it was on my left side. Now it was on my right, which would make sense if I was hiking the loop in the opposite direction, but I had been following the trail markers the entire time. I stood there, staring at my phone screen, trying to make sense of the pattern. According to my GPS tracking, I had been walking for over 4 hours, but the trail it showed me taking looked like a series of loops and figure eights, rather than the straight circuit I thought I'd been following. By this point, the sun was starting to get lower in the sky, and I was beginning to worry about running out of daylight. I decided to try retracing my steps back to the last landmark I was sure about. But as I turned around and started walking back the way I had come, I realized that the blue blazes were still pointing me forward, which meant that either the trail markers had been deliberately rearranged or I was completely losing my mind. I followed the blazes backward for about 20 minutes, and sure enough, I came to another landmark I recognized. It was this weird rock formation that looked like a giant chair. But when I had taken a picture of it earlier, I was walking uphill and the rock was on my left. Now I was walking downhill and the rock was on my right. The terrain itself seemed to have somehow rearranged itself. The next hour was when things went from confusing to genuinely frightening. I continued following the blue blazes, and I started recognizing more and more landmarks from earlier in the day. The lightning bolt tree, the fallen log, a distinctive boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, but they were all in different positions relative to the trail than they had been before. That's when I started to get the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't anything specific at first, just that prickly sensation you get on the back of your neck when you think someone's eyes are on you. Then I started hearing sounds that didn't belong, little cracks and rustles in the underbrush that seemed to move in parallel with me as I walked. When I stopped, the sound stopped. When I started walking again, they resumed. As the daylight started to fade, I made the decision to set up camp, rather than risk getting even more lost in the dark. I found a small clearing about 20 yards off the trail and set up my shelter. As I was rolling out my sleeping bag, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the soft dirt around the clearing, boot prints, roughly the same size as mine, but they were arranged in a perfect circle around the spot where I was setting up camp, like someone had been walking in a continuous loop around that exact location. The prints looked fresh, and they definitely hadn't been there when I first entered the clearing. I spent that night barely sleeping, listening to every sound in the forest. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear something moving in the darkness beyond my shelter. Footsteps, branches breaking, the soft rustle of someone moving carefully through the underbrush. When morning came, I packed up as quickly as possible and started following the trail again. But if anything, things got worse. For the entire second day, I followed the same sequence of landmarks in the exact same order. The lightning bolt tree on my right, then my left, then my right again. The fallen log, the bear-shaped boulder, the rock chair, over and over in a pattern that made no logical sense. By the second night, I was starting to panic. That second night, I set up camp in the same clearing as before. I didn't have much choice, since it was the only open space I had found in 2 days of hiking. But this time, when I checked the ground around my campsite, there were 2 sets of footprints. Mine from the night before, and a fresh set that had been made sometime during the day while I was on the trail. Someone had been to my campsite while I was gone and had walked around in another perfect circle, just like the first set of prints. But this time, the circle was smaller, closer to where I would be sleeping. On the third morning, I made the decision to try something different. Instead of following the trail markers, I was going to pick a direction and bushwhack in a straight line until I either found a road or some other landmark. After about 2 hours of difficult hiking, I emerged from the forest onto a gravel road. I could have cried with relief. I followed the road, and after about a mile, I saw a familiar sign for the Pine Ridge Loop parking area. My car was still there, exactly where I had left it 3 days earlier. But here's the thing that still bothers me to this day. According to the trail register at the parking area, no one else had signed in or out during the entire time I was missing. I'd seen other hikers on my first day, but somehow I was the only person who had been on that trail for the entire weekend. A few weeks later, I got curious and decided to do some research on the Pine Ridge Loop. What I found didn't make me feel any better about what had happened. According to the State Forestry website, the Pine Ridge Loop had been permanently closed to hiking 3 years earlier due to unsafe trail conditions. The blue blazes I'd been following were supposed to have been removed, and the trail was officially off limits to the public. So either I had spent 3 days following a trail that didn't exist, or someone had gone to a lot of trouble to maintain an abandoned trail and keep me walking in circles. I never did figure out who had been leaving those footprints around my campsite, or why someone would want to trap a random hiker on a closed trail. But I do know that I haven't been back to that part of the state forest since then. Sometimes I still have dreams about walking through those woods, following blue blazes that lead nowhere, passing the same landmarks over and over while something watches me from the shadows between the trees. My name is Sarah, and this happened last summer during what was supposed to be a routine 3-day backpacking trip with my 2 closest friends, Jake and Devon. The 3 of us had been hiking together for about 5 years, and we considered ourselves pretty experienced. We had picked a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, about a 40-mile stretch that would take us through some beautiful mountain terrain over 3 days and 2 nights. Jake had been the one to suggest the route. He's always been the planner of our group, the guy who researches every detail. We started the hike on a Friday morning in early August. The weather forecast was perfect sunny skies, temperatures in the 70s, no chance of rain. The first few hours went exactly as planned. We made good time on the trail, stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook, and were generally having a great time. Around 2 p.m., we stopped for a break, and Jake pulled out his GPS unit to check our progress. We used GPS as a backup to traditional map and compass navigation, mainly just to make sure we're staying on schedule. That's when we noticed the first sign that something was off. According to Jake's GPS, we had been hiking for about 6 hours and had covered approximately 2 miles. That couldn't be right. We're not particularly fast hikers, but 2 miles in 6 hours is barely a crawl. Jake checked his GPS unit and said the batteries were fine and the signal strength was good. He showed us the screen, and sure enough, it indicated that we were about 2 miles from our starting point. But that made no sense, because we had definitely been hiking uphill for most of the morning. Devon suggested that maybe there was something wrong with the GPS unit itself. We decided to rely on our paper map and compass for the rest of the day and check the GPS again later. But as we continued hiking, Jake kept checking the GPS periodically, and the readings just got more and more bizarre. After another 2 hours of hiking, during which we climbed several steep sections and crossed 2 stream valleys, the GPS showed that we had moved less than half a mile. By early evening, we were starting to get genuinely concerned. We had been hiking for almost 8 hours, and according to every landmark we could identify on our paper map, we seemed to be making normal progress. But our GPS was telling a completely different story. Devon pulled out his own backup device, but both units showed the same impossible readings. According to the GPS, we had been walking for nearly 9 hours and had covered a total distance of about 3 miles. That's when we started noticing the footprints. We were taking a break beside a small stream when Devon pointed out some boot prints in the mud along the water's edge. At first, we assumed they were from other hikers, but as we looked more closely, we realized that they looked exactly like our own prints. Same tread patterns, same sizes, even the same distinctive wear mark on the left heel of Jake's boots. But that was impossible, because we hadn't been anywhere near that stream before. We decided to set up camp right there beside the stream. As we were setting up our tents, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were more footprints around the area where we were camping, and they weren't just random boot prints. They were arranged in a perfect circle around the spot where we had chosen to pitch our tents. The circle was maybe 20 feet in diameter, and the prints went all the way around with no gaps. Someone had walked in a continuous loop around that exact location. But the footprints were ours. Same boot treads, same sizes, same everything. It was like we had been there before and had walked around in a circle for no apparent reason. None of us remembered doing anything like that. We had a pretty restless night. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, and I kept thinking I heard voices in the distance. Not conversation exactly, but more like someone calling out. The voices were too faint to make out any words, but they sounded familiar somehow. In the morning, we decided to try a different approach. Instead of following the trail, we were going to use our compass to hike due south until we hit a road or some other landmark. But as we started hiking cross-country through the forest, our GPS readings got even stranger. According to both devices, we weren't moving at all. We could see that we were walking, but the GPS coordinates remained exactly the same no matter how far we traveled. After about 2 hours of hiking through difficult terrain, we emerged into a clearing that looked familiar. Too familiar. It was the exact spot where we had camped the night before, right down to the flattened areas where our tents had been. But that was impossible. We had been walking due south for 2 hours using a compass. There was no way we could have ended up back at the same location. That's when we found the second set of footprints. In addition to the circular pattern from the day before, there was now a new set of prints that led away from our former campsite in a straight line heading south, our prints from that morning. But the trail only went about 50 yards before it curved back around and returned to the clearing in a perfect loop. According to the physical evidence in the dirt, we had walked in a circle. But according to our compass and our own perception, we had been walking in a straight line. We decided to try following the stream we had camped beside. Water always flows downhill and eventually reaches a road. But after following the stream for several hours, we found ourselves back at the same clearing again. The stream formed a perfect loop that returned to its starting point. By this point, all three of us were starting to panic. We had been hiking for 2 full days, and according to our GPS, we hadn't moved more than a few hundred yards from our starting position. That second night, we decided to stay awake and take turns keeping watch. Around 2 a.m. during my watch shift, I heard voices again, but this time they were close enough that I could make out what they were saying. They were our voices, mine, Jake's, and Devon's, having the exact same conversations we had been having during the day, but coming from different directions in the forest around us. I woke up Jake and Devon, and the three of us sat there listening to our own voices echoing through the forest. It was like listening to a recording of our day being played back by hidden speakers, but the sound was moving, circling around us in the same pattern as the footprints. The voices continued until dawn, and then they faded away as the sun came up. We decided to try one more time to climb our way out. We hiked uphill for 4 straight hours until we reached what appeared to be a ridgeline. From the top, we could see roads and towns in the distance. Jake pulled out his GPS one more time, and for the first time in 3 days, it showed that we had actually moved. We were about 15 miles from our starting point, which meant we were way off course. But at least we were making progress. We spent the rest of the day hiking toward the nearest road, and by evening, we had made it back to civilization. But here's the thing that still bothers me about the whole experience. When we checked our GPS tracks later, they showed a completely normal hiking route. No loops, no circles, no impossible geographical features. just a straight line from our starting point to where we ended up. It was like the strange loops and circular patterns had never existed, but all three of us remembered them clearly, and we had the photos of the footprints to prove that something unusual had happened. Sometimes I still hear those voices in my dreams, our own voices, having conversations we had already had, circling endlessly through a forest that refuses to let us leave. My name is Amanda, and this happened during a solo hiking trip last fall that I'm still trying to make sense of. I've always been comfortable hiking alone, and I consider myself pretty experienced when it comes to backcountry safety. I had planned a 4-day solo backpacking trip on a section of trail I had hiked several times before with friends. It's a beautiful area in the mountains of North Carolina, with several peaks over 5,000 feet and some spectacular views. I started the hike on a Thursday morning in late October. The fall colors were at their peak, and the weather forecast called for 4 days of clear skies. The first day went exactly as planned. I hiked about 8 miles to a designated campsite near a small mountain lake. The second day was when things started to get strange. I woke up early and was on the trail by 7 a.m. About 2 hours into the hike, I was climbing through a section of dense forest when I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. Someone was calling for help. The voice was distant and muffled, but I could clearly make out the words, "Help me, please help me." It sounded like a woman, and she seemed to be in genuine distress. I called back, "Where are you? I'm coming to help," and started moving in the direction the voice had come from. But as I got closer to where I thought the sound was coming from, the voice seemed to move further away. I spent about 20 minutes trying to locate the source of the calls for help, but every time I thought I was getting close, the voice would seem to come from a different direction. Eventually, the calling stopped completely. About an hour later, I heard the voice again, but this time, something about it made my blood run cold. The voice calling for help sounded exactly like mine. I'm not talking about a similar voice. I'm talking about my exact voice, with my exact intonation and accent, calling out, "Help me, please help me," from somewhere in the trees around me. I tried calling back, but as soon as I opened my mouth, the other voices stopped. I waited for a few minutes, and then they started up again. Always my voice, always calling for help, always coming from different locations around me. This continued for the rest of the day. Every time I would start hiking, I would hear my own voice calling for help from various points in the forest. Sometimes the calls sounded panicked. Sometimes they sounded weak and exhausted, but they always sounded like me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear my voice calling from somewhere outside my tent. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that made me grab my headlamp and unzip my tent to look outside. My voice was calling for help, but this time it was coming from directly above me, like someone was floating in the air 30 feet over my campsite. I shined my headlamp up into the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The calling continued for about 10 minutes, always from directly overhead, before it finally stopped. On the third day, the voices became more frequent and more disturbing. Instead of just calling for help, I started hearing my voice having full conversations with itself. "Where are you going?" my voice would ask from the left side of the trail. "I'm lost. I can't find my way out," my voice would answer from the right side. "How long have you been out here?" from behind me. "Days, maybe weeks. I can't remember," from somewhere ahead. the conversations always followed the same pattern. One version of my voice would be asking questions, while another version would be giving increasingly panicked and confused answers. That third night, the conversations continued all night. Around midnight, I heard something that made me seriously consider abandoning my gear and hiking out in the dark. My voice was describing my current campsite in perfect detail, the color of my tent, the way I had arranged my gear, even the specific rock I was using as a pillow. "She's sitting in her tent right now," my voice said from somewhere in the darkness. "She can hear us talking about her, but she doesn't know what to do. She's scared, but she's trying to convince herself that none of this is real." The description was so accurate that I started to panic. I grabbed my headlamp and searched the area around my campsite, but I couldn't see anyone. "Now she's looking for us with her flashlight," the voice continued. "She thinks if she can find the source of the voices, she can make them stop. But she doesn't understand that we're not really here. We're echoes of her, trapped in the mountains." On the fourth and final day, I packed up as early as possible and started hiking toward the trailhead as fast as I could safely travel. But the voices followed me for the entire day, and as I got closer to the end of the trail, they became more and more desperate. "Don't leave us here," my voice pleaded from multiple directions. "We've been waiting for you to find us. You're the only one who can hear us. Please, you have to help us get out." Another version of my voice called from behind me. "We've been trapped here for so long." The pleading continued for hours, and by the time I reached my car, I felt emotionally exhausted. A few weeks later, I found something that made me question everything. I was going through the photos I had taken during the trip, and I noticed something in one of the images that I hadn't seen when I took it. In the background of a picture I had taken of a mountain vista, there was a small figure on a distant ridge. When I zoomed in on the figure, it looked like a person wearing the exact same clothes I'd been wearing. Same jacket, same hat, same backpack. The figure was too far away to make out any facial features, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The problem was, I had been completely alone on that section of trail, and the ridge where the figure was standing would have required several hours of difficult cross-country travel to reach. But deep down, I knew it was me. Somehow, another version of me had been standing on that ridge, watching me take the photo, and if the voices I had been hearing were real, then there might be other versions of me still out there in the mountains, calling for help from places I'll never be able to reach. I haven't been back to that trail since then, but sometimes, when I'm hiking alone on other trails, I catch myself listening for my own voice calling from somewhere in the distance. And sometimes, I think I hear it,